Perfect. Well, hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us on a Friday afternoon. I know that I've had a chaotic morning, so I'm really glad that people are able to find some time and be in community with us today. My name is Prashasti and I'm really thrilled to welcome our fantastic group of panelists today who will lead us into a discussion on immigration and racial capitalism. And this is a part of our Immigration and Scholar series, which houses under our new justice-oriented program, Immigration and, which is open to everyone. So I'll drop a link into the chat. And we've also held several discussions throughout this year, and all of our recordings are available. So I really encourage you to dive into this discussion. Today's space is a space of reflection and hopefully some imagination. So we will start today with welcoming our panelists and then be in conversation with them for about 50 minutes. We will end with some resources that I'll also send in a follow-up email. Throughout this time, I will be monitoring our chat. So if you have any questions for our panelists or comments, feel free to put them in the chat and I will make sure that we can raise it to the moderator. With that, I will hand it over to Zhina, who is a current staff editor, but also our incoming editor-in-chief for the Georgetown Immigration Law Journal, and will be moderating our discussion for today.
Thank you, Prashasti. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to start by inviting our panelists to introduce themselves briefly, keeping it to 1 minute. I know that's not nearly enough time. So Prashasti will also drop links to the panelist bios as well in the chat. So we're going to go ahead and start with Professor Mitchell-Eaton.
Great. Well, thank you so much. First of all, I just really want to acknowledge and appreciate the work of Prashasti and Zhina for organizing this session and for hosting us today. It's such a pleasure, and I know we'll have a really rich conversation. So my name is Emily Mitchell-Eaton. I'm an incoming assistant professor of geography at Colgate University, and I'm a feminist political geographer. So what I study is at the sort of the crux of my work is the intersection between US empire and migration. So how does US empire, as it expands sort of territorially, change the relationship between its new subjects or residents and rights of citizenship and migration. And particularly, I look at the experiences of people living in the US, formerly or currently occupied US islands of, including the Marshall Islands. In my book, New Destination of Empire, which is under contract with Georgia Press, I follow Marshall Islander diasporas to Arkansas, where I look at questions of race, non-citizenship, and also coalitional immigrant-led solidarity movements. And then finally, before coming to my life as a geographer, I also spent 2 years as an immigration paralegal in the Bay Area. So policy and law is really something I'm very interested in thinking about, sort of how it works in immigration and how policies kind of travel and move and change as they do.
Thank you. I'll pass it to Todd Miller.
Hi, thank you so much. This is great to be here, and I really appreciate all the effort that went to organizing this panel. It is really an honor. I'm a journalist and an author. I'm based in Tucson, Arizona. Right now, I'm actually, you probably can see, I'm kind of on the road between Tucson and another place. I've written 4 books looking at the border. One's called Border Patrol Nation, which kind of looks at the kind of massive post 9/11 expansion of the border apparatus. Another one's called Storming the Wall, that tries to link between climate change, displacement, and borders. The third one is called Empire of Borders, which follows US federal money abroad to many different countries where the United States is promoting border programs in different places around the world, much following Professor Mitchell-Eaton's work. And then my last book is called Build Bridges Not Walls. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here with you all.
Thank you, Todd. And Professor Munshi.
Hi, thank you to everyone for organizing this event and the series. The series looks fantastic. So congratulations to all of you who are putting this together. So as some of you know, I teach at Georgetown. I teach property. So I was happy to see many students here, a course on racial capitalism and migration. A lot of the writing that I've done on immigration has tried to sort of shift the legal, kind of the fixity of a legal framework, that doesn't question the nation state. And a lot of the work that I've done is kind of explore the continuities between histories of empire, imperialism, settler colonialism, and the emergence of a border control regime, right? And so that's a lot of what I have been interested in doing, given where I'm situated, thinking about the continuities between imperial formations and immigration restriction. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're going to go through a few questions. I want to highlight that not all the panelists have to answer each question. Each question is pretty long and has a few subparts, so definitely feel free to pick and choose which part speaks most to you. But we're going to start today with historical context. So we wanted to begin by exposing how immigration laws perpetuate or sustain racial capitalism. And can you spell out for us how is racial capitalism manifested in and perpetuated through current immigration policies? What histories or mechanisms come to your mind? And I'd like to start this question with Professor Munshi, please.
Thank you, guys. So I wanted to sort of respond to your question about history, rather than sort of like by plotting through kind of history of racist legislation, which I think many of us are familiar with by now. And I guess I wanted to say a little bit about what I think is at stake in the turn to history, right? And I think the turn to history for me is motivated precisely in this shift from thinking about race and racialization, let's say, and racial capitalism, right? So I want to kind of keep racial capitalism in view as we think about this question. And racial capitalism, I use that term to think about the constitutive role that colonial capitalism has played in creating and maintaining forms of racialized difference, subordination, but also most importantly, exploitation and expropriation, right? So for me, so forgive me if I go on at length with this answer, I promise I'll keep it brief with other answers. So for me, racial capitalism is an important corrective to prevailing liberal frames of inclusion and diversity, non-discrimination and multiculturalism, and lately anti-racism, depending on what we mean by that term, right? And that liberalism has been far more comfortable with diversifying the personnel tasked with advancing the project of liberal empire or colonial capitalism than, for instance, dismantling those social formations, right? So liberalism has always been far more comfortable with affective injury than material redress, more comfortable with symbolic change than material restructuring, more comfortable with non-discrimination than redistribution, more comfortable with talking about race than capitalism. And so insofar as it's a kind of colorblind liberalism that tends to flatten social differences, rendering race a kind of surface difference, like an accident of birth, or racism, rendering racism something like a problem of bad manners or a kind of cognitive tick. Again, I think racial capitalism as a framework helps us think critically about the ways in which race and racism are produced to advance a particular form of political economy structured in inequality. And again, exploitation, expansion, expropriation, extraction, right? Okay, so let me, if I have a couple more minutes, just offer a brief illustration at what I think is at stake in this kind of shift from a framework of anti-racism to racial capitalism in the immigration context. So I want to talk about the advocacy of some immigrant groups. So as you know, in one of his first acts as president, Todd Miller knows well, Donald Trump promised to build a border wall. Right, along the southern border of the United States. Trump, of course, insisted over and over again that Mexico would pay for the wall, but to my embarrassment and astonishment, a group of South Asian organizations in 2018 offered that they would pay for the border wall, right? How would they pay for the border wall? Well, they proposed or recommended that the United States should expand opportunities for high-skilled migrants, right? Create more visa slots, basically, for high-skilled migrants. And at the same time, eliminate certain visa categories, which tend to benefit people from poorer countries, right? The diversity lottery visa, they refer to, using Trump's language, as chain migration, right? And the proposal was that you could impose higher fees on these high-skilled workers that would raise enough money to help participate in the construction of the border wall, right? Okay, so again, as a child of immigrants from India, South Asia, this proposal was incredibly offensive to me because it advances a claim for immigrant inclusion by reinscribing the logic of settler imperialism, right? Rather than, again, challenging it. So when migrant groups assert their qualifications for visas or for citizenship in terms of human capital, right, then they tend to articulate rather than re-articulate rather than disarticulate the terms of liberal capitalism on which settler colonialism is founded. They also participate in well-worn racial discourse that implicitly distinguishes the deservingness, the supposed deservingness of certain kinds of settlers, right, over and against Black, Indigenous others, right? And then as Indigenous scholars, this sort of appeal for immigrant inclusion within the settler nation also participates in reinscribing the nation state form and erasing Indigenous difference and priority. Again, finally, wrap it up, right? What's at stake in the shift from anti-racism to racist capital then is, again, we have to remain vigilant about the ways in which immigrants can be recruited to participate in reinscribing, again, the legitimacy of nation state form and the monopoly that it claims over the right to migrate. That itself is a relatively recent historical development, as well as like the criteria for membership and inclusion, right? So if we're thinking about racial capitalism rather than inclusion, then we might begin to think about, for instance, the histories that connect Black and Indigenous immigrants with subjects of former colonies, right? Or other potential forms of solidarity, again, aligned against imperialism rather than sort of claiming inclusion within it. So again, the problem with this sort of appeal is that it's a bid for inclusion within imperial formations rather than a kind of challenge of that sort of formation.
Thank you, Professor Munshi. I want to open it to Professor Mitchell-Eaton as well on this topic.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Professor Moonshi, for that really incredible opening to sort of thinking about how racial capitalism moves us away from these sort of liberal understandings of inclusion and racialization, which can be very superficial and also, as you said, sort of have this retrenchment effect of actually working, sort of folding in these kinds of exclusions into systems that ostensibly are meant to include, right? Which I think is one of the main contributions of racial capitalism as a framework is to think about the way that racism is always self-modifying, right? It's always adapting to fit new orders, including orders of liberal democracy, or if we're thinking about the Canadian context, more sort of language of multiculturalism, the melting pot, right? Whatever sort of the current conditions call for. So I think I'll answer this question by just talking a little bit about what, as a geographer, a human geographer, and geographers think a lot about sort of the question of scale, and I often refer to this as sort of the degree to which we zoom in on a problem or zoom out geographically to understand it. And so for me, the question of understanding the history of immigration laws, and I focus on the US immigration laws, but these are, we can think about these in other contexts, other imperial contexts, is to say we cannot understand US immigration laws by looking simply at the scale of the nation state. We always have to look transnationally and imperially, right? Especially in the US. So I'm teaching a class, I forget the current title of it, but in the past I've taught it as Race, Empire, Citizenship, which is a sort of a historical study of US immigration laws through the framework of the expanding US empire. And what happens when sort of as US territories expand, again, what happens at those borders as they move and as people move across them. So in this class, we're talking a lot about sort of how they're at pivotal moments. You can look at debates over immigration or citizenship in the territories, and if by looking at what is happening with other processes within US empire of capitalist extraction, of military expansion, and the establishment of bases, you can get a better understanding of why these policies look the way that they do. So I'll give you a really specific example from my own research. From after World War II, from 1946 to 86, the US was the sort of, the euphemism is the colonial administrator under the purview of the UN of an entity called the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, right, which encompassing more than 2,000 islands. Now, that has since dissolved, and most of the islands in that area, Micronesia and the Marshall Islands and Palau, are now formally sovereign states. But they also have these incredibly close bilateral agreements with the United States that allows for not only visa-free migration of their residents to the United States, which is incredibly uncommon, but also paired with that, this extended US exclusive military base access to places like Kwajalein, right? right, in the Marshall Islands, which is recently extended until 2086, right? So we have to understand those provisions that were elaborated in tandem as a kind of a bilateral agreement to be sort of part and parcel of the geography of where we study immigration law and immigration policy. So it's a different kind of, Professor Munshi was encouraging to think about different sort of histories and genealogies of racial capitalism. And I guess I'll just sort of add that there are lots of different geographic scales at which we can look at immigration policy, which we often think of as sort of only happening maybe at the federal level, but also is articulated at many other levels as well.
Thank you, Professor. And Todd, I'd love to hear your perspective on this question as well.
Yeah, well, I very much appreciate what everyone has said up to this point. I did one of the things that that occurs to me, and I'll just say this quickly, is the year 1994. 1994 was the year of the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and so if you remember, before that was happening, it was promoted as this is going to solve the immigration problem, right? That was coming from the Clinton administration, and then but behind closed doors, the INS at the time that was in charge of the borders was saying, no, this is gonna, there's gonna be significant displacement in Mexico, and so what happens is you have in 1994 the implementation of NAFTA, which then corporate opens up the borders for corporate power to go right across, and specifically into Mexico from the U.S. and also Canada. And on that same exact year, you have the prevention through deterrence strategy being implemented, first through a Border Patrol memorandum, and then through a number of operations: Operation Gatekeeper, Operation Hold the Line, Operation Safeguard. One of the reasons that this was happening was because the INS, the immigration agency at the time, knew that NAFTA, the corporate power, displacing people, like millions of indigenous farmers were displaced due to corn coming over across the borders, that was going to cause displacement and migration. So the hardening of the borders and the opening of the borders to capital, to me, that those mechanisms are what come to mind.
Thank you. Professor Munshi, you mentioned this in when you were speaking, you spoke a bit about the racial hierarchy. So I wanted to kind of expand on that a little bit in terms of speaking about how the immigration policies play a role in that racial order, and more specifically, what role does the border itself play in creating that order? And I'll actually start with Professor Mitchell-Eaton on this and then open it to the other panelists. Professor, I think you're muted.
Oh, I think you're invited to speak first.
I'm sorry, were you asking me? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for this question. So I want to answer this question about borders and racial hierarchy by talking a little bit about a link that Cedric Robinson actually draws in writing about racial capitalism between geography and the process of racialization through capitalism. Right. So in Black Marxism, he observed that the quote, the tendency of European civilization through capitalism was not to homogenize, but to differentiate. So to exaggerate regional, subcultural, and dialectical differences into racial ones. And exaggerating racial differences into regional differences into racial ones, of course, as we know, has also been a key project of US immigration law, as well as through projects like the eugenics movement and neo-Malthusianism, which have also really heavily and really consistently informed US immigration law. So as I mentioned earlier, immigration law, immigration sort of law shapes the way that people are able to move across borders and between nation states, but also within space at different scales in their communities, et cetera. So one of my favorite definitions of geography, and one that I really like to use with my students, is one from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, the geographer. And she says that geography is the study of why things happen where they do. Right. So if we take this definition of geography seriously, right, that everything has a geography, then racial concepts are also always spatial concepts, right? As geographers like Gilmore and Laura Pulido also write about, thinking about the way that racial capitalism is built into landscapes and also has a kind of reinforcing effect on landscapes. So I'll bring this back to immigration law and come back to Robinson's formulation. What does it mean to exaggerate regional differences into racial ones? So one perfect example is the Immigration Act of 1924, or the Johnson-Reed Act. So this is an act that I'm sure many of you have come across before. It's infamous for instituting a system of strict ethnic quotas, right, or national origins quotas, which in effect limited the number of people permitted into the US based on nationality, codified the Asian Exclusion Act, right, which had been sort of in place in piecemeal ways prior to that. And of course, it also dramatically it pushed back the border, right, in a sense of sort of requiring immigrants to apply for and receive visas before it arrived, as well as by establishing the US Border Patrol, which Todd Miller, I think, can speak to as well. But it also did something else that is really interesting and that I've been looking at in my own work, which is that for the first time, the 1924 Immigration Act conflated nationality with country of origin and with race, right? So it said nationality equals race plus country of origin. Right. So in other words, it exaggerated regional differences and named them racial differences, right, per Robinson. So the intent behind this shift was to limit incoming immigrants to, quote, 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in the US as of the 1890 census, right? So in other words, it was attempting to sort of nail to the wall and codify some sort of vision of a pre-existing racial distribution existing in the states, excluding people of African descent, excluding indigenous populations, right? And to bind this ostensible ethnic hegemony of homogeneity of the nation. So in other words, in binding race to the nation state, what it does is to give us this precedent that we still see in US immigration law now, which is to sort of make territory and space equivalent to a racial category. And both were reified, both were given sort of this idea of being objective natural categories by the way. Right. So not incidentally, geographers were also involved in this process of mapping race onto territory. So in 1917, for example, you have the head of the American Geographical Society, Isaiah Bowman, who would later become the president of Johns Hopkins University, create and had a commission to map the Eastern Europe into territories that would then be corresponding with ethnic divisions. Right. And he is known at the time for working with other noted eugenicists who are very much informed by this idea of sort of like creating taxonomies of place that also map onto taxonomies of people, of races. Right. So again, sort of just to kind of bring my remarks to an end here, race is not the only way of creating differences and then exploiting them. Right. As we see through sort of a racially informed understanding of eugenics, we can also see that eugenics is a project about disability, right? And critical disability studies and disability justice has taught us that we always have to understand racialization and disability is bound up in race. So that's another sort of key point, I think, is to think about how when we're trying to study the time periods in which these particular legislation come through and we read them as about race, we can also read them as about these intersections of other sort of phenomena that are creating difference and that are sort of being absorbed into the societal mindset or ether in other ways, like eugenics. And then finally, that at the same time, we also have these debates over whether the Constitution should follow the flag to places like Puerto Rico and later to the Philippines. So again, another kind of question about borders and how rights should move with or not the expansive US empire.
Professor Munshi, did you want to address this question as well?
I could just offer a brief reflection, following Emily's really, really amazing remarks, which is, some of what you were just concluding with brought to mind also Du Bois, who writes about whiteness, right? He says, what in the world is whiteness? It's ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen, right? And this comes up to me a lot in my thinking about property law because of that term ownership, but it's also about the earth. And so he's also writing in the period that you're talking about in the early part of the 20th century, recognizing, right, that what whiteness looks like in this kind of moment of global imperialism is a claim to mobility, right? At a time when everybody else is being demobilized, when Black and brown people are also being demobilized, right? The end of, high empire, you have, again, the emergence of immigration controls to demobilize people in the formerly colonized world. He's using the same language that eugenicists are using to describe, wave upon wave, right? Like people lashing on the shores of white, white settler colonies, really, right? So anyway, so that's one thing that some of your remarks brought to mind. And I guess I just wanted to say one other thing to put on the table is something is an invitation to think about with some of our other panelists, which is that I've been interested in recognizing the way in which people who are now crossing the border, the southern border, are racialized or not racialized, right? So as we know, increasingly people who are crossing the southern border are indigenous people from Guatemala, Honduras, right? And they're often in the news characterized in that way by their nationality. But again, we know that they're indigenous people whose interests have never aligned with the settler colonial regimes that they are fleeing, right? A lot of them are people who are have been resisting settler colonialism for 100 years, resisting the effects now of extractive industries, right? But there's a way in which indigeneity animates, I think, a lot of the racism on the part of like Trumpians, right? In that it's as though we're kind of a white settler colony sort of barricading ourselves against like the barbarians at the gate. That's the way in which I think that migration has become kind of racialized within a white settler imaginary. At the same time, all the ways in which indigeneity confers certain kinds of status and recognition are effaced as soon as indigenous peoples cross the border. And that's something I've become really interested in thinking about, especially as we, paired with climate migration, because that's also a big part of the story and the way in which that migration becomes legible or less legible.
Thank you, Professor. That actually segues perfectly to the next question. This one's for you, Todd, if you can start us off with this. You've written extensively about the climate crisis and movement and how it intersects with border militarization. Can you walk us through what role the border plays in making people, as you call them, environmentally exposed or environmentally secure? Where would climate refugees fit within the racial hierarchy in the US?
Yeah, I think, how I'd like to start with this particular question. There was I guess there's a report done by the Pentagon in 2003. And in this report, they were looking at a worst case scenario due to climate change in the world, what would happen. And one segment of the report, they said, and I'm gonna have to remember, I'm sorry for this, but that the United States and Australia, I don't know why they chose just those two countries, but the US and Australia would have to build up quote unquote defensive fortresses then to stop, and they use these exact words, unwanted starving immigrants from the United States. There's a couple sentences and they turned directly to the US point of view and they said unwanted starving immigrants, quote unquote, from Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. And with the Caribbean, they said, in parentheses, an especially severe problem. And so to me, that 2003 report kind of answers your question in a lot of ways. But if you want to go like 2000 to 2003, there's assessment after assessment that the US government has given from the Pentagon, and then post 2010 Department of Homeland Security as well has done assessments looking at climate, looking at like there's reports done by this Department of Homeland Security that look at Central America and talk about droughts that are happening, or hurricanes, or precipitation events, or mudslides, or floods, or sea level rise, and how that would be directly impact displacement. And then they follow it up with nothing about any sort of status or anything like that, but more to what DHS's mission is, which is to quote unquote secure the border, right? So I think the words that they use in the documents is to prepare our borders for possible mass migrations. And so, so you can see how this fits into the racial hierarchy and even the other, racial capitalism, right? Because you have the United States as well as the number one historic emitter, right, of greenhouse gas emissions. If you compare that with Central America, the Central American countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, I forget what it is, but it's some ridiculous ratio of U.S. contribution to these the greenhouse gases compared to Central America. Yeah, and yet, it's the United States building up its, fortifying its borders, building walls, having these technologies, building these detention centers, and for people who, as it's predicted, are across the globe, are going to be increasingly displaced. And I guess I'll leave it at that for.
Thank you, Todd. I think that's really important. Thank you for sharing that. So now I want to kind of start getting into some possible solutions. So now it's clear that the U.S. has always relied on exploitation of labor, and that varies based on where you are in that racial hierarchy. Given the historical and ongoing exploitation of labor in different ways, is it possible to redress the harms of exploitation and expropriation? What does reparations look like? And Professor Munshi, I'd like to start with you. I know you briefly mentioned this in your opening. If you can please expand on that.
Okay. I do not know what reparations look like, but I think, again, thinking, sort of specifically about my institutional location, kind of as a teacher, I think following, Todd's remarks and what I learned from reading his book is that we really have like a crisis of imagination around the question of migration. And that's the thing that I've been interested in sort of thinking about in my work. And it's again that we just sort of take for granted the givenness, right, the intractability of this nation state form. And to me, the thing that's significant about the nation state form is not only that it kind of has these ideas about who belongs where, but this idea that the nation state as a kind of political form, this is Hannah Arendt's critique, right? It arrogated to itself for the first time in world history this exclusive monopoly to determine who gets to go where, when, under what circumstances, right? Whereas once upon a time, people did move around the world with a little bit more freedom for all kinds of reasons, right? And so I think like when I learned from Todd's book that right now, like the Department of Homeland Security does anticipate that climate change will send millions, tens and hundreds of millions of people from their home. And the only thing we can imagine doing is like securing the resources that we want in those parts of the world and pointing guns at people who might come. That is like a crisis of political imagination and legal imagination, and it's untenable, right? And so it's like morally untenable, obviously, but it's even practically insane. Right. And so I think like we really need to sort of begin to cultivate other kinds of imagination. And that's the work that I think that we can do in these kinds of spaces. And that's what I want for my students.
It's actually very similar to a conversation we were having in my Justice and Accountability class yesterday about creative solutions and how, we need more of that in these discussions. I'd like to open that question to our other panelists as well.
I'll take that up. I mean, I think what Professor Munshi has said about the need for creative solutions or imagination. I'm thinking about sort of the call for radical imaginations around a lot of the sort of intersecting structures that we're analyzing that produce this crisis of whether we think of it as a crisis of rights or mobility, the right to mobility or the right to remain. Nation states did not always have a sort of what's the word that I'm looking for? Absolute sort of control over those kinds of processes, and therefore they need not always, right? And so in your question about redress and reparations, I think it becomes a question also about sort of like what are some of the tactics and strategies we employ or movements employ, and we as scholars, as practitioners of the law, as educators use to support them, whether those go through the law in a sort of legal sense, or if they use the law as one of many tools to contest the terms of settler law, right? As defining, for example, sovereignty as something that's mutually exclusive, that's hierarchical, right? That doesn't allow for an understanding, for example, of sovereignty as relational or sovereignty over resources, as sort of articulated by many more sort of indigenous understandings of sovereignty. So that on one hand, we can think about like a reparations act like Section 177, which is that which gave reparations to nuclear survivors in the Marshall Islands of the extended nuclear testing that the U.S. military conducted there from 46 to 52. I have the dates right there. And so, while an important gain, a very important gain for those survivors, one of the things that it had, one of the effects that it had, and the sort of legal scholars can help me fill in the terminology here, was to limit the sort of the terms who would be considered sort of eligible for that redress, and to sort of close the book on that, right? So within a certain geographical area that was defined as sort of directly impacted, and within a certain generation, right? But as we know, as many of us know, like nuclear effects travel over place. They cannot just like people. It's very difficult to actually just hold them in place, and they also travel intergenerationally, as do the harms of these other kinds of violences, state violence that we are talking about. So that radical imaginary can also sort of, I think, has to think across generations and across place to look for examples of more radical, more holistic kinds of redress, which may be, I draw a lot of inspiration from sort of land back movements, right, from I Don't Know More, from a lot of the sort of the work and the Puerto Rican sort of struggles over sovereignty and fiscal sovereignty over the last couple of years, and with Ricky Renuncia, to sort of think about, like, what does it mean to actually take back control over our island, whether that's an immigration, citizenship, or sort of control over tourism. Anyway, so what I mean to say there is that, like, we have to expand our imagination of how the law and policy can also serve us, but not be limited to its bounds.
Todd, would you like to address this question as well?
No, I think the answers are just great, and I very much agree.
So in kind of a similar vein, the human rights framework within immigration tends to ignore the role of the US in maintaining legacies of colonialism and imperialism. Professor Mitchell-Eaton, a key focus of your work is thinking about this tension and the intersection of migration and decolonization. Can you please walk us through how we can, or how we should, approach movement of people across borders in more ethical ways?
Yes, thanks. And I'm very eager also to hear what the other panelists have to say about this. And Todd, I'm also thinking a lot about your work on climate, and how climate change and sea level rise is going to force a lot of these conversations to the forefront. Specifically, as islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific are sort of at the forefront of climate change displacement, and of course, as we know, many of those islands are also under sort of layered histories of colonial rule. So migration as decolonization. Immigration and citizenship in the U.S. colonized spaces has always been complicated, right? Part of what I theorize as imperial citizenship in my book is sort of how citizenship plays out at the margins of the empire. And what I really mean by that is sort of try to look at the nuts and bolts of how it often gets produced, right? So I argue that it's exceptional in the sense that it's often created through these piecemeal policies or bilateral agreements or treaties, right? For looking at sort of indigeneity and indigenous experiences of citizenship in what is sometimes called the mainland US. And that piecemeal nature, which is often sort of either as an addendum or an exception to mainstream immigration law, makes it vulnerable because it's always contingent and revocable under those same policy mechanisms. Right. But citizenship and migration in the colonized spaces also is often very hard. It's unintelligible when migrants get to the mainland. Right. So, it blurs these divisions between sort of metropole and colony, or foreigner and citizen, legal and illegal. And so that in-betweenness can make it really hard for migrants carrying those kind of uncommon statuses. Right. Whether it's the COFA, the Compact of Free Association status that I write about, or I'm forgetting the term for the TPS, right, that Salvadoran and other migrants have had, or refugees have had. So, they can kind of fall between the cracks. So in my book, I talk about sort of the exclusionary and violent nature of this as a kind of imperial citizenship. But your question about migration as decolonization, I think, also brings up this point about how these in-between precarious legal statuses and the people that hold them can also produce a lot of possibility for coalitional organizing. And so, for an example, you know, when we see, again, in my work, places like Arkansas or Oregon or Hawaii, you know, if you have Micronesians and Marshall Islanders organizing with undocumented Mexican and Central American workers that may work together in a poultry factory, which is a common kind of work that many immigrants in Northwest Arkansas are doing, to sort of contest both the terms of precarious legal status as immigrants, but also to try to raise awareness about the imperial derivations of that kind of precarity, not just for people that have formerly been under U.S. empire, but as you know, I think Todd's work shows how U.S. empire stretches into Latin America, into Mexico and Central America, and through different mechanisms, perhaps, right, through things like NAFTA and its predecessors. But how we can also, if we bring those things to the fore, it can be a really powerful way of for immigrant-led movements and anti-racist movements to kind of contest those kinds of structures. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to open that up to our other panelists as well, if you'd like to discuss that. Todd, Professor Munshi? Yeah.
I would love to hear Todd's response. Yeah.
Okay, Todd.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, thinking of, yeah, it's, yeah, I'm trying to like wrap, you know, get articulate my thoughts, and because it's very like goes into like one of my first thoughts might be just a very simple one, but when I think of you know, as we're like looking at borders and the, you know, the rate, and even back to the racial hierarchy and the origin, you're looking at the origins of borders and how they, you know, came to be, and how they have the colonial foundation to them, right? Like when you think of Africa and the Berlin Conference, or, you know, or the you know, the Tanatam in southern Arizona, you know, looking at the surveyors that came onto the, you know, and just into the territory, saying we're drawing a line here, and they're saying no, this, you know, our territory goes, you know, this way, that way, the other way. You know, this whole idea of the border system now, and how, and its reaches and its tentacles, and how it expands, and the mechanisms that it uses, and the vast, the different hues and the different types of mechanisms that it uses. I don't see how you cannot think of it as a neo-colonial like apparatus that even when I look at a color-coded map, right, in my office, if I were in my office, I'd be looking at a color-coded map, and my whole worldview is going to be around these nation states, and that's how I'm supposed to think of things. And so the idea that Professor Mitchell-Eaton, you know, the idea that of migration as decolonial process is very much, I mean, it seems to be intrinsic within the actual act of it, right? As a, you know, the subverting the border, or subverting the multiple borders, you know, and that the multiple obstacles that are put in people's ways. Each of it seems to me is a decolonial act, because they're subverting what, you know, this entire history of it. I mean, that's my first kind of initial response. There's so much more to what Professor Mitchell-Eaton was saying that I think I would like to write an essay about it, right? So, but that's that was my first thought.
Thank you. And Professor Munshi? If you'd like to address this question.
No, I mean, the only thing I feel compelled to add, although I don't think, you know, that Professor Mitchell-Eaton is saying this at all. Sometimes when I hear excitement about an idea like migration as decolonization, we have to be vigilant about the neoliberal version of it, which we don't want to, which we don't want to sort of mistake for the project, right? And so relatively affluent people from places like India with, to go back to the example that I went to, who sort of mistake their own migrancy as a form of subalternity, as Gayatri Spivak would caution, right? Like that we need to resist that as a form of like kind of neoliberal exploitation of a kind of capital produced by multicultural liberalism, right? And I just want to be clear. So again, nobody's saying this here, right? Nobody here is confused about this. But that's something we just have to sort of also be vigilant about, I think, when we're talking about racial capitalism.
So I want to end today's discussion with a little bit of dreaming and think about what we can and are willing to do to commit to dismantling capitalist regimes. What actions do you envision dismantling capitalism to require? How do we move towards global and international accountability? And what can the role of lawyers be in this? And Todd, I'm going to actually start with you on this question. And I'd love to, again, hear from everybody on this as well.
Sure. I mean, big question, right? The dismantling the capitalist regime. That's I mean, when I think about it, for example, from the kind of border imperialism point of view, to borrow the term from Harsha Walia, like one thing that always irks me, I guess I could put it, is when the discussion of immigration reform or comprehensive immigration reform is always placed as a domestic, right? It's placed in the domestic sphere. And I think both Professor Mitchell-Eaton and Professor Munshi have both mentioned this, right? That when you look at, you have to have a transnational point of view, and the idea that, like, if you're looking at immigration reform from a U.S. policy, a U.S. perspective, and from U.S. policy, how can you not be looking at, if I'm gonna think about dismantling capitalist regimes, how are you gonna not think about the capitalism, the neoliberal capitalism, or how the capitalism pushed, imposed upon the world by the United States, and how its dispossession and displacement, and its causes of displacement in people, and not have that as part of the conversation. So I mean, to just parse it out into one thing, that's one thing I definitely think of when thinking about how to dismantle. Well, let's have it in the conversation to begin with, right? How can you not talk about immigration without talking about that? You have to talk about the capitalist regime to talk about immigration, and not only in terms of dispossession and the extractivism, but also climate change, right? The climate change conversation. If there's certain countries that are more responsible for that due to the same thing, capitalism run wild, the industrial capitalism and the pollution that it's producing, then those countries also, that should also be a part of the conversation, that is causing displacement. So to be able to look at those things, and instead of expand the conversations, to start looking at those things and placing those responsibilities. I wish, maybe that's one thing.
Thank you. Professor Mitchell-Eaton?
Sure. Excuse me. Yes, I would say where can we start? As Todd pointed out, it's a big question, right? So in 2 minutes, my solutions are join your union and start thinking of yourself as a worker, and then ask what your union is doing about international worker solidarity, right? So unions, actually US-based unions and the international unions in IWW, the workers unions internationally have played incredible roles, both for better and for worse, for immigrant rights, right? Some have a history of being sort of incredibly xenophobic and advocating to sort of exclude different groups, particular groups of immigrants from workers' rights protections in the US. Others have taken on sort of a more sort of third worldist kind of solidarity approach to support workers from other countries and in other countries, right? In part by sort of dismantling this idea that the country is the only or the most significant form of sort of identity, right? Like worker identity is really important as well. So that's one thing that I would say, and that's not something that we have to wait for sort of like some kind of communist or socialist revolution. We don't have to wait for the DSA to say we can do it, right? And as we've seen recently, the DSA, I think, has just removed its sort of platform on Palestinian support because of backlash or concerns about BDS, right? So it doesn't always come from the top down. It need not. I think we can look to models for sort of anti-hierarchical models. We can look at models of abolition and mutual aid that we can practice, and many are already practicing in their communities, that move away from our sort of a punitive carceral model of understanding who gets what. And it's hard, right? This is not like it's not an easy sort of set of solutions, but there are alternative, very well-developed alternative models of getting people what they need and want that we can draw on, and those are movement led, right? Those are it has been built in by grassroots organizers for many decades now. So yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
Thank you. Professor Munshi?
I mean, I think those were fabulous answers. And so the only thing I'll supplement is just to amplify something I think I heard in Todd Miller's response, which is that I think that talking about rights I think we can begin to think that we've reached the exhaustion of a kind of rights discourse. And I think it's especially in the immigration context, when we're talking about climate migration, other forms of migration, again, returning to Hannah Arendt's critique of the nation state, I think that part of what the problem, the crisis of the nation state is as Professor Mitchell-Eaton suggested, it's that it obscures other forms of solidarity, potential kind of like alignment of interests across lines of, work solidarity, that sort of thing, but also responsibility, right? Relationality is something I also heard in her remarks, but also like a responsibility. I think like in the immigration context, we would have far more interesting conversations if we talked about responsibility rather than rights. And that's, again, that's a kind of like framework shift, and that's all I'll add to that.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes. We're going to address a few questions from our audience. We have one. So this is from a journalist. Their question is about US imperialism and its colonial tendencies. The question is, does this directly connect to imperial Rome? And I will open that up to the panel. Whoever would like to answer that one. Professor Mitchell-Eaton, you look like
I will.
Okay.
Like, what do I say about imperial Rome? So a disclaimer that I really know very little actually about the history of imperial Rome, other than it's often given as sort of a counterpoint or a counterexample to some of the more contemporary empires. What I will say is that I think there is usefulness, both intellectual and sort of political usefulness, in thinking comparatively and relationally across empires. So, in understanding the way that they work and understanding the way that people have lived in them, survived them, and resisted them. And also the way that they adapt. We're talking about racial capitalism as always adapting to meet sort of more contemporary needs of a system, racial capitalism. Right, empires don't always work in the same way. So Professor Munshi was naming sort of this period of, in the sort of the long durée at the end of the sort of formal empires of Western Europe, right? That really starts to sort of come together after World War II, and we see this incredible wave of formal decolonization across Africa, across South and Southeast Asia, and which is an incredibly important transition, political transition at a global and transnational scale. And the result of liberation movements, not of human rights frameworks necessarily, right? But then we can also think about the sort of adaptive techniques of an empire like the US to try different ways of sort of maintaining that kind of hegemonic control, more at a distance, right? Less through sort of formal governance and more through, again, kind of bilateral partnerships or these other kinds of different ways of sort of managing power over territory and people. So but then we also have sort of the example of the Windrush generation, the generation of brave, mostly Caribbean and African migrants going to the British imperial metropole in London and elsewhere in UK to claim their rights as workers, as citizens, right? Met with incredible retaliation, including as recently as in the Theresa May government in 2017, right? But nonetheless, we're not short on examples like that, so we can look to those as well. no, that's not a very good answer to your question, but.
Thank you. So we have about 2 more minutes, so I just wanted to open this time to the panelists. If there's anything else that you felt like you wanted to address that you didn't get to, we'd love to hear more from you at this time. Okay, well, thank you all so much. We really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us, for volunteering your time, for having these conversations with us, especially amid the pandemic. We really appreciate it very much. Thank you everyone for joining. We are going to have our next discussion about movement lawyering on April 5th, and Prashasti will be sharing links in the chat, and we'll follow up with an email after this as well. Again, thank you so much. I know as a law student, these conversations are extremely helpful, to help ground me kind of in the chaos that it feels like law school is sometimes. So I really appreciate your time and your expertise. It is extremely valuable.
Thank you guys. And I'm just gonna say, like, these are like the best events that I've seen at the law school.
Thank you so much.
I want to echo that incredible job organizing, I mean, the resources that y'all put together. This is just such a well organized set of sessions. So thank you.
I'm going to give all the credit to Prashasti. She is the star here.
Thanks, Prashasti.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
all
Thank
so
you
much.
for joining us.
Have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.